Hi, this is Pushpa Naurim, and today we are going to discuss about wage determinations under bilateral monopoly. Here we are going to understand how wages are determined under the bilateral monopoly situations. Bilateral monopoly, this is a market situations where there is a single seller and a single buyer. Okay, so if you have to think in terms of labor market, you see who sells the market, who is the seller of the labor. They are the one who will be the selling their labor are called laborer. Okay, who are the buyers? They are the employer. It means that employer will be the one who will be hiring the labor in exchange of certain amount of wage rate, and seller of the labor, it means that they will be selling their labor or their service to the employer in exchange of certain amount of wage or income. Okay, so under the bilateral monopoly situations, it is a case of one seller and one buyer. It means that a case of monopoly from the seller perspective and the case of monopsonist from the buyer perspective. It means that you see labor are generally unorganized. They are not a part of union in general sense, but in the case of bilateral monopoly, this unorganized labor are organized under a union. Okay, and this trade union, they represent the workers, and they will negotiate with the employer on their behalf if anything's come up related to the wage in particular. Okay, so one employer, that means the case of monopsonies, it means that in a particular area or in a particular city or in a small town, there is a possibility that there is one big industry or one big firm that will act as a single buyer or a single employer in that particular area. Or it is also possible that many employer may collude together or may group together and act as a single employer. Okay, so when there is a case of one seller of the labor, it means that monopoly from the seller perspective, and one employer, it means that monopsonies from the buyer perspective. Okay, so under bilateral monopoly, we are generally talking about one seller, that is monopoly or the union, and one single buyer, which means monopsonies. These are the employer. So under bilateral monopoly, there are generally two limits. First, upper limit, and second is lower limit. Upper limit, it is the highest wage rate that the trade union wants for its worker. It means that they will be trying their level best to negotiate with the employer to give the highest amount of wage rate for its member. Okay, and the lower limit, it means that on the other hand, the employer will try its level best to give the lowest amount of wage rate to the employer. Okay, so while the union will ask or negotiate for highest possible wage rate, the employer will always try to give the lowest wage rate. So the negotiations or the determinations of wage rate will be happening between these two range. Okay, and at what amount of wage rate or at what point the wage is determined depending upon the negotiating power of the trade union and the employer. If the negotiating power of the trade union is higher, then it will be nearer to the upper limit, and if the negotiating power of the employer is higher, then it will be nearer to the lower limit. Now look at this diagram. We are first going to understand this from the monopsonist perspective, that is from the employer perspective. Okay, from the employer perspective, the supply curve of labor, it represents the amount of labor that is going to be available at different amount of wage rate, and it is an upward sloping curve. This is an upward sloping curve because with higher wages, more amount of labor will be supplied. Think it this way. Say suppose if in the market, uh, if a particular employer is giving or providing higher amount of wage rate, at that higher amount of wage rate there will be more amount of people who will be willing to work at that wage rate. It means that higher wage rate means that higher supply of labor at that particular wage rate. Since there is a positive correlations between the higher wage rate and the increase in the supply of labor, the supply of labor it's an upward sloping curve. Okay, and from the perspective of the monopsonist, supply curve of labor is also average fixed cost of labor. Average fixed cost of labor is simply the total cost of labor divided by total labor being hired or employed. Okay, this means the cost per unit of labor hired or employed. Now the marginal fixed cost of labor. For the monopsonist, marginal fixed cost of labor, it represents the additional cost that is being incurred by the employer to hire the additional unit of labor. Okay, and why the marginal fixed cost curve is marginal fixed cost curve lies above the supply curve of labor, or the average fixed cost of labor. This is because as the employer want to hire more and more unit of labor, they have to incur extra cost for hiring additional unit of labor. For example, if the employer want to attract or to hire additional unit of labor, they will have to provide higher amount of wage rate to the additional worker in order to attract it to the market. And it is because of this reason that marginal fixed cost of labor lies above the supply curve of labor, or the average fixed cost of labor. Okay, now you see the marginal revenue product of labor from the monopsonist perspective. Monopsonist perspective is a downward sloping curve. Why this is a downward sloping curve? This is a downward sloping curve because as more and more unit of labor is hired, okay, the additional revenue that is being generated by the additional worker will keep on diminishing. Why this is so? This is so because of the diminishing marginal return. Okay, diminishing marginal return says that as more and more unit of a factor is employed, the additional revenue that is being generated by the factor, it will keep on diminishing. Here factor in this particular context is labor. Okay, so it is a downward sloping curve. So you see the point where marginal fixed cost of labor and marginal revenue product of labor intersect is the profit maximizing point for the monopsonist. Okay, so at this point E, it is the profit maximizing point for the monopsonist. Okay, when you draw down the line corresponding to this E, when you draw down the line, it determines the level of employment and OL naught, level of employment. And again, the point where it touches the supply curve of labor or the average fixed cost of labor, it determines the lower wage limit. Lower wage limit. Lower wage limit determines what? It is the wage rate that the employer is willing to provide to the worker. Okay, by determining the wage rate at W naught, he is giving E dash amount of wage lesser to the worker. Okay, this E dash is the amount of monopsonist exploitation that is willing to throw it to the worker. Okay, now you see at this particular, I'm repeating it again, at this particular point E, this is the profit maximizing point for the monopsonist. At this point of equilibrium, when you draw down the line, level of employment of OL naught is determined, and The point where it touches the average fixed cost of labor or the supply curve of labor, it determines the lower wage limit. Okay, so this is the amount that he is willing to pay to the worker. Now let's try to understand this from the perspective of the union. Okay, from the perspective of the union, this marginal revenue represent the additional revenue that the union can negotiate for each worker as more workers are hired. It reflects how much additional wage revenue that the union can secure based on the firm total revenue that is generated from labor, or in other words, the negotiating power of the union will dependent upon the paying capacity of the employer, okay, or the firm. Now you see that demand for labor is dependent upon the marginal productivity of labor, okay, and marginal productivity of labor will decreases as more and more unit of labor will increase. And again, from the employer perspective, the wages of the labor is determined by their marginal revenue product, okay, and we know that the marginal revenue product of labor will decrease as more of the labor are hired. So more labor means less wages, okay. Due to this nature of marginal revenue product of labor, as they decreases as more workers are hired, the additional revenue that the union can negotiate for each member is also limited. And it is because of this reason that marginal revenue curved from the perspective of the union lies below the marginal revenue product of labor, and this is from the employer perspective, or the more from the monopsonist perspective. Okay, having discussed this, let us try to understand what does supply curve represent from the perspective of the union. From the union perspective, supply curve of labor, it also represents the marginal cost. Like we said it earlier, that under the union, all labor will come under the union, okay, and the employer just cannot independently employ labor just like that. It means that if they want to hire labor, then they must go to the union for employment or to get labor, okay. So it means, as say, suppose if the firm or the employer want to get some worker, okay, and he wanted to hire some worker at the $20 per hour, okay, worker, initial worker. Now the employer wants to get more worker to get employed in his firm, okay, and in order to attract more workers, now the firm demanded, not the firm, I mean, now the union demands $25 per hour to attract more labor, okay. And say suppose if the employer still want to hire more worker, it means that the union might demand $30 per hour, okay. Now the union is demanding $30 per hour. So the increase in wage rate from $25 to $30, it shows the additional cost or the marginal cost of hiring more worker, which is represented by the supply curve of labor, okay. So the supply curve of labor from the perspective of the union, it shows the relationship between the wage rate and the quantity of labor that the union is willing to provide, okay. So it is it indicates how much the wage needs to increase to encourage more worker to offer their labor, okay. So as the employer hire more worker, the union might require higher wages for additional labor. This is because attracting additional worker often require paying higher wages. Therefore, supply curve reflects the increasing wages needed to recruit more workers, which is essentially the marginal cost of hiring each additional worker. Now, this supply curve of labor, like I told you, this represents the marginal cost curve, and here is the marginal revenue from the union perspective. So The point of intersections between the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve of the union is at T. Okay, and when you draw up the line in such a way that it touches the marginal revenue product of labor, it forms the upper wage limit. It means that W2 is the maximum limit or the maximum negotiating point from the perspective of the union. This is the highest wage rate that the union can negotiate, and beyond this he cannot go. Okay, and corresponding to this line, when you draw down that you get the level of employment. It means that at this point of equilibrium, where the marginal revenue of the union and marginal cost of the union intersect, it form the level of employment in the market. Okay, so here W2, this is the upper limit, the maximum wages that is wanted by the union, and W0, this is the lower limit. It means that this is the minimum wage rate that the employer is willing to pay. Okay, so according to the bilateral monopoly, this wage determinations will take place between these 2 points. It means that any point that lies between W0 and W2 will determine the wage level in the market. So at what particular point this wage will be determined is not known, because it depends upon the negotiating power of both the party. Okay, so if the negotiating power of the union is higher, then it will be somewhere around it will be nearer to W2 point, and if the negotiating power of the employer is higher, then it will be somewhere near to W0, but it will not go below W0. Okay, this is the minimum wage rate that he is willing to pay to the worker. Okay, now say suppose if the interest of the worker if the interest of the employer is to negotiate for higher wage rate and comparatively lower level of employment, then at the union will negotiate at point W2, and they will hire the level of employment at OW1. Okay, now say suppose if the interest of the union is to increase the level of employment. Okay, if he wants to increase the level of employment from OL1 to OL2, that means that he has to compromise with certain amount of wage rate. It means that the wage rate has to be decreased in order to increase the number of employment. Okay, so if he wants to employ OL2 level of employment, then he must accept the wage rate that is OW1, the point of intersections of demand and supply curve. Okay, and this is basically the bilateral monopoly, where we have discussed from the perspective of both the monopsonist, that is from the perspective of the employer, and the monopolist, that is the union in this case. I think you find this video helpful. Thank you for stopping by.